So I did my presentation on Tuesday, and I've been on strike for the last 2 days, so I haven't had a chance to go through them. But is there a clicker that I can use? Okay. So I'll just give a bit of background about myself before I talk about my topic, which is looking at how gendered Islamophobia has emerged. So just a bit about myself. I originally studied economics at university, then I went to work in government. 2005, I left government and started doing a master's, and as some of you will recall, 2005 was the year of the London bombing. So that I went to study at Birkbeck, looking at how race and racism kind of impact British society, and that was the kind of context in which I studied. So since then, I've been working at Sussex, teaching on race, and specifically working on Islamophobia and gendered Islamophobia. My PhD was about looking at the counterterrorism agenda and looking at the way the idea of Muslim women was kind of being constructed in that policy narrative. So I'm just going to go through some kind of basic slides which I normally give to my students when I'm trying to explain about racism and how we should think of Islamophobia as a form of racism. Okay, so the topic we were given today was talking about hate crime. So I think hate crime, we all understand what we mean by a hate crime. But I think what happens when we talk about everything in terms of hate crime is that we ignore the kind of wider environment within which hate crimes occur. It ignores structural issues such as law and policies, and it ignores discourses and narratives, the way in which things are talked about. So instead, we need to ask, rather than just looking at hate crime and sort of criminal redress, etc., we need to think about why specific groups of people get targeted at specific moments in time. So, as I said, we need to think of Islamophobia as a form of racism. There's been lots of kind of public debate about whether it is racism or not, and does it deserve sort of a different category. And people often say, well, you can't be racist against Muslims because Islam is not a race. That's a very common retort. But we need then to go back, what is racism? Stuart Hall argued that race is a floating signifier. That means its meaning is not fixed, it is discursively produced through discourses and representation. So whether that's through scientific or literature, art, policy, media. So historically we know that race has been kind of analysed in terms of physical differences, biological difference. But they have only mattered because meanings have been attached to those physical differences. But ideas of biological race have been discredited. UNESCO issued a statement saying, the human race is one race, there are no biological races within that. But what's happened instead is that the idea of cultural difference now forms the basis of racism. So rather than trying to just attribute difference to people on the basis of physical differences, is thinking about cultural difference. So I'm simplifying here. There's a long history of kind of cultural racism, which maybe in the questions I can kind of respond to. But basically, we're talking about how cultural difference kind of produces stereotypes. And those stereotypes are reflected in the media, in policy. And that was my own interest when I was studying the government's PREVENT agenda, the counterterrorism agenda, which emerged sort of in 2006 onwards. How did those narratives, how did they talk about Muslims? What were they kind of saying about Muslims in the policy narrative, which has now sort of fed into sort of mainstream public discourse? And I think the thing here, and this is what my specific focus on, is how are these stereotypes gendered? Yeah, so generalizations are made about people on the basis of cultural difference, but these generalizations are gendered, so they vary between men and women. And so, there's a long history of Muslim presence in Britain. The first mosque was in the late 19th century. And historically, the population has been very diverse. If we think about post-colonial migration from the subcontinent of India, but also long histories, historical presence of Yemen sailors, and then, an increasingly diverse population from across the world, from Somalia to Afghanistan to Bosnia. So despite these kind of physical differences, these different Muslims have been pulled together as one category because of their religious affiliation. And so they could be considered to be a race in the sense that generalizations are made about people within that category. And I would argue there have been variations of anti-Muslim racism for centuries, but it increased in the late 1980s In the UK, the Rushdie affair, that kind of had a big impact in the way Muslims were represented in public discourse. Obviously 9/11 in 2001, and then increasingly in the context of the war on terror, in the context of the London bombings and the kind of aftermath, the policy aftermath. So the stereotypes are, we all know what they are. Muslim men are prone to extremism and they're sexual predators. We look at the way that the grooming scandals have been framed as being a cultural issue rather than thinking about it in terms of sort of gendered violence, which exists everywhere in society. And equally, the stereotypes of Muslim women as being traditionally submissive. That was David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, using that terminology. But also that Muslim women are uniquely oppressed, and it is their religion that oppresses them, and therefore they are in need of empowerment. So in terms then of, so again, going back to my original point, these ideas are rooted in kind of the idea of cultural difference. And so I think the thing to remember when we're talking about hate crime, sometimes, in the work that I do, I've often got, people who work in counterterrorism kind of approach me afterwards and saying, well, the increase in hate crimes is always after a terrorist attack. Therefore, the terrorist attack is the reason why there are increased hate crimes. But the point is, why are specific groups of people targeted? What is it that, makes people imagine that that person is individually responsible? It's because of this kind of racialization of Muslims. And so they've made a generalization, whether it's about brown men with beards and rucksacks, irrespective of their religious background. These are the kind of signifiers that indicate that somebody might be Muslim and therefore a target. And obviously we know about the kind of disproportionate attacks on Muslim women specifically. And I think what's kind of interesting about the way that Muslim women are represented, we have this narrative, this stereotype of the oppressed Muslim women who need to be rescued. But then also you have this kind of, the other side of that is, well, they become the targets of physical violence by racists, right? So why does that happen? Boris Johnson, when he talked about, he likened women wearing the niqab to bank robbers, there was a 375% increase on attacks on Muslim women. So words matter, yeah? And so we do need to, when we think about hate crime, think about that environment within which those crimes occur. But I also want to add, hate crimes is obviously the kind of the extreme end of that type of behavior, but anti-Muslim racism operates in a much more subtle way in the workplace, in terms of, who is seen to fit into a particular workplace. We know that women who wear the hijab often feel pressurized not to wear the hijab when they're looking for work. But also, if we think about the wider policy context of immigration policies, the counterterrorism agenda, and how that creates this kind of narrative where specific groups of people are seen as other, as demonized, as dehumanized. And so hate crimes might grab the headlines, but they ignore the everyday lived experiences of Muslims affected by anti-Muslim racism. Yeah? Okay, so, yeah. Okay.